This is Full Coffers with your host, Phil and Toni Buggs from Abundant Harvest Christian Fellowship Ministries.
And this week on Full Coffers, The Journey, Part 24. So we are back. You know, one of the things that I recognize when I listen to a lot of different podcasts is I kind of don't know where they are in time. Now, podcasts that deals with the news and current events, you kind of know that they're in the here and now. But sometimes there's podcasts where I don't know when they recorded it. I don't know, So I thought we could take a moment to give our listening audience a little bit of a timeline as to where we started and where we are today. How does that sound to you, dear?
Sounds good to me.
All
Let's
right.
do this.
So we began our first or aired our first podcast of The Journey back in May of 2021. Now, giving you a little context, this particular podcast that we're doing right now, we scheduled it originally for June of 2024, but that didn't happen. So for those of you who are listening to this podcast, we are currently, as of today, February the 2nd, 2025.
Wow.
So again, starting from from May of 2021
Right.
to February of 2025,
Right.
that if you do the math, that tells you how long we have put out this podcast called The Journey.
Right. Not consistently every week, but we have been on this journey since May of 2021.
Now, for those of you who may listen, you may ask the question, or you may not could care less. Why'd it take y'all so long to get this thing done?
Because life happens.
Yeah, life definitely happened. Boy, did life happen.
Wow, the journey. Yeah. Life happening.
Life happened. And, we were talking earlier today as we were preparing for this podcast, a scripture that I have seen to embrace wholeheartedly. Not that I don't, but there's certain scriptures that definitely are very meaningful. And one of those scriptures came from Proverbs, the 16th chapter, the 9th verse.
Right.
And it talks about a man plans his way, but God ultimately directs the path. So I'm a checklist girl. I have this nice little package agenda, and I go check. I mean, I'm a Franklin planner, baby. I had my planner. I checked off the things that I wanted to accomplish today, what I didn't accomplish today. I put a little dot that says, oh, we're going to take care of that on tomorrow. And I felt this sense of satisfaction when I could check off that list.
Jesus was setting you up.
Yeah. He said, you can take your little checklist. But ultimately, it is God's timing.
It is.
That, it took us this long. It took us this long because, giving a little bit of a spoiler alert, we're coming to the end of our journey. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But this component, the journey, is going to be coming to an end very soon. Now, the question is, why did you all start this in the first place?
Okay.
We started it because, first of all, we need to validate that we are experts. Right now, in today's vernacular, they have something called SME.
SME.
Yeah,
Subject matter experts.
Subject matter experts. And so, before we could get out there to try to encourage or advise or just, talk to people about challenges that the believer faces, we had to come clean and share the things that we have experienced as believers so that we can validate, yeah, buddy, I know what you're going through.
I.e., we are subject matter experts.
More than I care to be. But that's why we wanted to start this podcast called The Journey, to talk to you all about what we have experienced as believers.
Yes.
The good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yep. As a couple, as when we first started it, just as two people dating, that's where we started telling the listening audience who we are. And we just allowed you as the listening audience to share with us, or not share with us, share in our retelling of the journey that we've been going through, what we've been facing, and some of the plans in which we made, and how God was humored by our plans. And he says, I didn't tell you that was going to happen.
Yeah, and more so, that's not going to happen.
As well-meaning couples find out as they go along the marriage life, and then the child bearing lives, and then the raising of children, and now raising adult children, and while going through our own metamorphosis of changes over the years. So that's that has been a part of, well, that's been the core of what we have brought to you as a listening office concerning this podcast called The Journey.
Exactly. And as I said earlier, we're rounding the bend. We are going to be ending this part of our ministry, Abundant Harvest Christian Fellowship Ministries, and we're going to be taking on a new platform. It won't be so much about our journey, but it'll be about something that we feel will be beneficial to those who are wanting to listen. So these next 2 to 3 podcasts may be a little bit longer than we normally would broadcast. We wanted to keep it at 30 minutes or less, but we wanted to let you know ahead of time that, these last few podcasts are going to be a little bit lengthy because we want to get to that point. Now, again, God ultimately will be in control of that, but it is the plan to kind of end the journey within the next 2 to 3 podcasts. So,
No, that's our plan.
that's our plan, but it could go
I.e.,
whatever.
that's Tony's plans. I'm just a little squirrel trying to get a nut in Tony's world. So
It's a fun world. Anyway.
says Tony.
So
yes, please, let's go.
last we left you, we were informed by our son Philip that he had, and I hate saying this, but he had graduated from weed
Marijuana.
to hardcore drugs. We're talking cocaine. And so that was a shock.
It was.
We knew, if you all listened to podcasts, previously, we had our first encounter with Philip and drugs in high school in the 10th grade when he was found on the premises using marijuana. That just kind of rocked our world then. But to have your son come to us after losing a job and we're wondering what's going on, and he confesses that he has a problem. He is using cocaine. And so we, again, had to figure out how are we going to navigate through this. But the blessing of it all, and Philip had mentioned in the previous podcast that I was a director at a behavioral health facility which treated adults for addiction. And so the subject matter wasn't new to us, but having it that close to home was new to us.
It wasn't in our plans. However, God put it in our plans because he directs our steps. Tony's knowledge in that area would prove to be highly needed, as we now, before, we're like bystanders looking at those who were involved in that life tragedy with their children or spouses. That wasn't part of our world. But as God allowed us to be impacted by a very stressful. It was new.
Yeah.
It was nothing that we went through, and I'm finding words hard to come. I don't know why, but we are involved in life, and as believers, if we have no relevance with what people who are having problems are going through, how can we apply the salve of what we have found to be successful, which is that relationship with Christ that allows us access to God to give us answers to problems that we have no idea of how to manage. But having access to God and that wisdom allowed us to not check out of the world, but to engage it and to embrace the hardships that we were going through because we love our children.
Yeah, and after the shock of it, understanding behavioral health, understanding that addiction is a disease. Back in when I came up, you're a drug addict. It's like, well, get out of here kind of thing. But over the years, I've discovered in even the workplace, addiction is a disease. And I'm not talking just drug addiction. Could be food addictions, all type. It's a disease. It's in what they call the DSM manual. It is a diagnosis, and so he had a diagnosis of drug addiction,
which disrupted our nice packaged Christian belief that if someone was underneath that possession, then we just had to pray it away. Well, what we find is that God endorses the medical field without absolving himself from having control and impact over it all. So we had to understand, or have to understand, the human mind, which enters us into the mental health realm, which is what Toni was going through, and I learned and am learning more about how that impacts our lives.
And that's something that it was challenging for us initially because, like Philip said, when we were kids back in the 60s and the 70s, people who were on drugs, we heard all kind of things. Oh, they're possessed by Satan, or they got this and that. And I believed it. And when people that I encountered or heard about in church who were on drugs, they were ostracized like they had the Black Plague or something.
Yeah.
And coming away from those experiences, getting into the nitty-gritty of it all, working in behavioral health when I was at that time, I recognized, because when I listened to these men and their women's stories about what they had endured as children and what they were trying to do to numb the pain of their past, and I looked at the science behind it and the process of getting people through, and sometimes they didn't make it the first time, they have to come back to treatment. What I recognized is, if it's true that God is the creator of all things,
which we do believe,
then God is the creator of science, behavioral health. There are some medications that are needed to curb the edge. I may get some pushback on this, but God is the creator of all things, and science is part of that.
And God is in control of science. And that doesn't take away from his wanting us to have a belief system in him.
Yes.
But he wants us to embrace all of life and all that what the enemy has done to corrupt it, disrupt it, disturb it. We are living in a fallen world. And I think that's the thing that gives me gravity, is that this is not what God designed. But God's redemptive plan for man will not be usurped or sidetracked by any weapons that the enemy uses against us, including that of affecting and impacting our mental state. So I just want to bring that out. There is so much more that we want to discuss in the mental health world. This is not that platform that we want to do, but we just want to let you know, as believers, we understand and we acknowledge that there is truth to mental health and medications physically that we have to use in order to help those who are seeking a closer relationship with God.
So
we're not talking about psychedelic trips, right?
We're not talking about, a black room with white curtains. We're not talking about that kind of stuff. But yeah, he gave us the full package with Philip, in that the prayer and the constant prayer, the constant prayer, in addition to the behavioral health facility that he went to, and the AA meetings and the NA meetings, all of that was the full package. And as a result, now all this came down like in June. And as a result of the constant prayer, the encouragement, the Philip, let's keep it moving, and the discipline that we had with him, the drug tests, when you come in that house, I'm going to take a pee test with you. Because, again, we're dealing with the people with addictions, and, their truthfulness is not always there. So we had to know. So God gave us all the tools that we needed to get Philip through. To the point, like I said, this all started in June, to the point where in December of that same year, we were putting Philip on a plane
to go back.
To go to Georgia, Fort Benning, Georgia, to do what? Go back to the Army. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? From June up until December of that same year, 2007, I believe it was, God blessed Philip to be able to get through his addiction issues and health, and we boarded him on a plane in December of 2007.
Yeah. The dates and times are not as critical as much as the journey that he had.
I think that was 2006.
But
2006. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we don't want to get too hung up on it. But to the point that from June, I believe, actually to August, we were able to, with Philip's cooperation and the Army at that time, he was allowed to go back in. There's a whole lot of legal things, not legals, routines or processes he had to go to. But long story short, he was able to re-enter, went through basic training, went through advanced infantry training, and actually had a duty station in Kansas by December of 2006.
Exactly.
That's what it was. Yep.
Sorry about the time frame.
That's all right. That's right.
But, it was hard. I won't say it was easy. It was. It created a lot of stress in our home. But by the prayers of that we lifted up, lifting Philip and I, lifting each other up with our son, it was hard. This was new territory, even though I worked in the environment. But again, it was home. It was in our home.
Yes.
But praise God, Philip did it. I mean, I was so proud of him when I went down to his graduation and he graduated and he did it. And I was just so proud of him. And Kyle, was back in Nashville. She was doing her thing too. So for a moment there was peace in our home.
For a moment.
And of course, if you guys know anything about this podcast, you've got to know peace don't always last a long time.
Oh, man. I remember that movie Armageddon when they're training to go up in there and they had those test flights. I love it when that guy said, I'm going to twist you and I'm going to turn you. And just about the time you think you're safe, I'm going to whip and twist you some more. This is all in process of training. As believers, to be spiritual warriors, we are constantly on guard. And I said we don't let our guard down. God allows us to celebrate victories without the danger of becoming lax. And definitely God, he gave us a brief moment to breathe, but then he whipped us and twisted us again with what we're about to share.
Exactly. When we were celebrating, or experiencing, I should say, that peace, it was one Sunday afternoon in 2007. Now, really quick, Philip, even though he graduated from the basic boot camp and all of that and was stationed in Kansas, he was still having issues, to the point where they were getting ready to give him what they call an Article
15. Not beginning.
Yeah.
They not only began to give him one Article 15 because of his behavior, he ended up with 4 Article 15.
Yeah, our son, as you probably can imagine, he don't do it little. If he's going to do something, he's going to do it all the way, And so we knew this was happening, and we accepted it. And so as they were transitioning him out, and eventually they did, he decided to stay in Kansas, and he did get a job, but, he just wasn't, there was something not right with him.
Still stirring in him. Yep.
So one Sunday, we're in Arizona, and he's in Kansas. It was in 2008. We get a phone call. And it was on the caller ID, it said from Kansas, and we didn't recognize the number. And I picked up the phone, and on the other end was an individual who identified herself as a nurse from the Pawnee Mental Health facility. Didn't know what the heck that meant, but
we were about to.
she told me that Philip had been arrested in Kansas, and while he was in the custody, he attempted to commit suicide by hanging. And what they did at that point was transition him from the jail to the mental health ward where he was at that time she was calling. Now, if any of you have ever felt this slap in your face,
or a 2x4 being swung across your face. Yeah, that comes close.
It stings.
Yeah.
It hurts. And, Philip and I were enjoying a Sunday afternoon. It was cold here in Phoenix in the wintertime, and we get this call. And at first, it was like a deja vu when I got the call when Philip was in high school saying that we have your son in juvenile detention for drug possession. I asked the lady then, are you sure you're talking about Philip Buggs Jr.? Same thing with this. Yeah. When I got the call, I put it on speaker where both Philip and I can listen, but she said that your son attempted to commit suicide by hanging, and now he's in the mental ward. And he is in the process of being evaluated. And to speed things up a little bit, we found out that Philip had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder.
Yep.
Now, we're stepping out into a different realm here. I knew enough about addiction. I knew nothing about mental health, even though mental health and addiction go hand in hand, but I was just dealing with Philip's drug addiction.
Yep.
I had no idea that beneath all of that, he was suffering from mental health. And now there's a name to it, bipolar.
Yes. And in fact, what we are coming into knowledge of in 2008, as we would learn as the years would roll by, we would recognize that diagnosis, Philip started that journey. The first time he was released from the Army as being what the term they use, he wasn't mentally adjusted in order to handle the rigors of Army life. It was during that time, I believe, that medically speaking, young adults are...
particularly males.
Males can be diagnosed with that disorder that may not even come out to years later, as was proven because Phil tried to self-medicate, and oftentimes it was either through drugs or alcohol, trying to get rid of those if I say thoughts that were in his mind.
Right,
yeah,
right.
in our and I do say it like this, naive Christian lives, and I don't mind carrying that burden, is that we were not prepared to understand the connection between faith in God and the use of medications in that process. We had the faith in God, and we thought that was all it took, but as we recognize are becoming wiser to how God put us together, there are certain medicinal things that he's left for us to combat those things that would ultimately impact our lives as living in a fallen world. So it's not medicine or God, it's medicine and God. And ultimately, it's God that manages the medicine.
Exactly.
So we want to make sure that that's clear, that we are not negating our faith for medicine. We are enhancing our faith in God by the correct use of medicine in that process. We're taking so much time here because this is definitely an area that many believers struggle with because of how we were brought up, which is not bad, but it's not the full story.
Exactly.
And we need to make sure that as you, the listening audience who are going through these things, you don't beat yourself up and you say, well, what did I do wrong? No. Satan would love for us to think that it's that. And at the core, it's still spiritual. But we also recognize that there is a medicinal component to our faith in God. Not instead of or in light of, but in conjunction with.
And so we're sitting there after that conversation trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And so, again, we're kind of doing some fast forwarding. It was decided that it would be best for Philip to stay in Kansas because there were services there
Right.
that he had access to in terms of the mental health component that we didn't know the first clue here in Arizona what to do. So we all decided to have him stay in Kansas. We kept in contact with
Right.
him a lot, but he was placed in a special apartment for people with disabilities, and he was seeing his psychiatrist. They were adjusting his meds. And so for a moment at that point in time, Philip was in good hands. We felt comfortable with what he was receiving in terms of services. But it kind of left us here wondering, because we had started out this ministry that we were doing, and
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
were, doing those things that we thought God had called us to do, and going through all of this. And also, we talked in the last podcast about a disruption that was happening in Phil Senior's life with
Yeah.
his spirituality. I don't know what you call it,
Yeah. It's interesting that you use the term because we've used it, and most recently we found it to have profound impact on what has been happening with us. God has caused certain disruptions in our lives in order to correct the path that He wants us to be on. Those disruptions come in the face of our plans. We plan a certain thing in life, but God disrupted in order to cause a correction to what He wants us to do and to become the best. I use the spiritual term, fruit bearers for Him. Well, you have to learn certain things in order to get certain fruit. And so God took Toni and I, or has been taking us through this process of disruption. Disruption in our relationships, disruption in the way we parent our children, our adult children, disruption in my ministerial calling, my disruptions in what I'm thinking ministerial calling in and what God is calling me to do for Him. So there's these constant stages and periods of disruption that while we're going through it, sometimes we don't even recognize it's a disruption. One of the things that happened during this time was the fact that I'm thinking, being called to the ministry, I would pastor a church, and we'd have this structured four wall, and people would just come in floats.
Hallelujah.
That didn't happen. But then I shifted to bringing it, we had it in community centers, then we brought it to our home, and then a disruption that shifted from ministerial to economic. This was during 2008, 2009 with the
Yeah, and I'm gonna break in just for a second in terms of the ministry that we thought was going to be a church, but we did recognize during that time, though, when we were having services in the facilities, I have to say that was a wonderful thing because we got out of our suits and dresses and stockings,
right.
and we purchased breakfast.
Yeah, I did gloss over
Yeah,
that, and I'm
yeah.
glad you slowed me
Yeah, you
down
slow your
because
roll, dude. Talk
because
about that.
I did. We in Michigan and even in Nashville, it was traditional, and I do say it like that, not as a negative, but that's just the way Christianity was practiced. Church was a staple, and it not that it is not anymore. But that was Nashville. That was Detroit. When I moved out here to Phoenix, first of all, it's too hot to be wearing that suit.
You got
So we
that
came
right.
out of the suits. But what I also recognize is that there was a yearning that God put on my heart that I shared before about relating to homeless people, relating to those in drug addiction. And He took me out of that, if I say that building, and He required me to go and feed those who were homeless, which is why we had the facility where we had it. It was in a very seedy part of Arizona, and we would go there. I'd set up, and we would have things to eat, and it would be so funny. And I don't say this; it was funny or is funny.
No, it was funny, man.
It was funny because most of the folks Sunday morning, 8 o'clock, we're serving breakfast. And these folk would wander from the streets and come in. Now, my religious mind says, oh, they're going to receive Christ. Them folk was coming in there to get off the streets and get something to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't recognize the value of relationship until I had to focus fully on what they needed. And that is so pivotal as we share the message of Christ with people. We need to meet them at their point of need.
And one of the things when you mentioned you shed the suit because we're hot and everything, but that's kind of an analogy or metaphor.
Yeah.
You shedded the church building, and again, we're not shedding Christ, we're not shedding the church, but you shedded the building of church, just like you shedded that hot suit.
We removed the barrier.
Yes.
And that's what sometimes we can. It's interesting because if I say biblically or spiritually, religiously, one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not serve idols.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that metaphorically, the idea of idolatry wouldn't seem to fit the idea of going to church. But if that's a barrier, that you are worshiping the building versus the content within the building,
that's a
barrier. That's a problem. So God that's past tense. He shed that barrier.
You better be careful how you say that.
Shed.
Yeah.
We removed that barrier. And so when people came in and they saw still the church functioning in a relational way, that we actually scratched where they were itching. So,
and just to kind of put a thing on it is that one of the things that we did, and don't get me wrong, Philip and I weren't rich by no means, but he would go every Sunday morning, get the breakfast, same grocery store, and we would bring it in. On first Sundays, get this, we would make a hot breakfast.
Exactly.
We would bring our pancake griddle and with eggs.
Yep.
And Philip literally would go out in the street and call them out.
That was so rewarding, but it was because I would walk down the streets and Sunday morning, everybody is, if they're up, they're hungover.
They've been all night long. They've
walking
been
the
using.
streets or whatever else, and I'd say, come to it was Keys Center. Come to Keys and get some breakfast, and that was so rich for me to go out and serve
and actually call them.
That was there was this empty lot where there was like broken down trailer homes and stuff, and I would yell and just says, God wants you to know that despite where you are, God sees you, God knows you, God cares about you. And it just, for me as a servant of God, to be able to bellow those pleas to come. God wants you. He wants to be in relationship with you. It was so rewarding to see those people. I would go back to the center, and they would start coming in.
It was almost like, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but it was almost like The Walking Dead coming in. And the thing about it, they knew that the presence of God was there. Not Philip and I, don't get that wrong. But the Spirit of God was there because the first thing they wanted to do is to wash.
Was to clean up. Now, some unbelieving listeners will say, well, they just wanted to get clean. But I believe most of them revered that building as a house of God. And I think that the Spirit within them connected with the Spirit of God, of nature, to say there are things that I need to do because the God of creation, I am in His presence. I want to clean up. And before they would touch any food, and that's the difference.
Yes.
Before they touched food, the first thing they did was went into the bathrooms
clean up. Yeah.
Now, if you just walk in the streets, you would just go after the food. You wouldn't worry. These folk had they had a reverence for God that oftentimes is missed with those, if I say, churchgoers that are just doing that. and so I don't
And
want to get on
so,
my tangent with that,
yeah.
but I
But that
could.
was just a wonderful
It is. It
experience
was, yeah.
seeing these individuals come in, and they were so grateful. And it's kind of funny because, again, we were still trying to navigate this thing. And so Philip, of course, does his sermon.
I still done prepared a 30-minute sermon, and it's so funny. I know, Tony, you get with this, but they would eat that breakfast. It would be warm in there,
inside, yep.
and they would
And,
want to. They
and,
would
and
sit.
Philip got this 30-minute sermon going on, and a couple of times after about 10 minutes.
It wasn't even 10 minutes. 3 or 4 minutes, they start, you see the eyes.
Yep, start dozing.
And one guy actually fell
Fell
out
out
the
the
chair.
chair. And it wasn't about getting happy. So we had to go back and say,
Yeah.
you know what? Maybe that 30-minute sermon, you need to get that oatmeal version, that instant oatmeal.
That's it. I had to strip that thing down to 5 minutes, and literally. And it's so interesting that we reach people in 5 minutes.
Yes.
And so I think, and I'll say it like this, Catholics might have it right.
I told you. Shoot. 30-minute mass, we out of there, buddy. I'm a recovering Catholic, okay? But again, the disruption that God placed in Philip's life about service and about what this whole thing was about, despite the struggles we were going through personally, we did that Sunday, day in and day out. And not to say that church is not good. I'm not trying to say that by no means, because let's face it, everybody can't do what we do. And that's not making it any worse or less.
No.
But there are some individuals that need the institutional church to attend and serve. There's nothing wrong with that. I was a part of that for a long. Philip's been since baby. But he made people sometimes do different things. He's designed us that way. And so, was it scary at first? Sure it was.
Very.
But at the end of the day, he conditioned us. Philip would go in apartment buildings sometime to witness, and he'd go by gangbangers with guns in their laps.
Yeah, they in their lap. But it's so interesting to know that when you come there with a purpose to give people God, they have a better and higher respect for you than someone that's just there trying to pawn something or trying to sell you something. Look, folk who are outside of the faith can smell a rat a mile away. And that's why a lot of us fail at our attempts to engage the lost, because the lost, they can identify someone else who's just there trying to get a hustle, but it's something else when you get there and you're not trying to sell them anything. You're trying to give them something, and they have a lot more respect for you, to the point that, like those people that we served at the community center, there were guys that I would walk up to, and I'd see the firearm, the piece in their hand. They would literally hide it, and it wasn't, I don't think, all the time, because these fellas ain't afraid of nobody. But I think it was the presence of God that
Not
they
Philip.
related.
Not Philip.
No, the presence of God, because we're talking spiritual warfare, and that's what that was. So walking upon that. Those fellas respected God to that point, and people serving God. And I didn't say everybody, but for those whom God led me to, that was the response. He prepared me for that engagement. So, the disruption that I've had from that church boy in Detroit to that preacher in Nashville, he has now evolved into a stronger spiritual warrior that is impacting folk who are not part of the not organized established church, but just the idea of church, period.
Exactly.
We are starting to. So there's that disruption, that's ministerial disruption. We want to go. Do we want to go back? Yeah.
Well, so again, I wanted to put that component in because as you're listening to us saying, how on earth did these people get through this? And a lot of it was during the time that we weren't necessarily going to a church on a regular basis. Don't get me wrong, when we came out to Phoenix, we had joined a church and things, but then God called Philip out. And as a result, we really haven't looked back since that time.
No.
But we were still going through the motions of trying to make sure Philip was okay, trying to make sure Kyle's okay, and still trying to minister to God's people, doing what we felt God had called us to do.
And then
until
March of
2009.
2009.
Yeah. I came home a little late that Friday night.
Yep.
Friday night was pizza night, man. Friday was pizza night, and 2025, Friday's still pizza night. So I got off of work late. I was ready for this pizza,
Yep.
and sure enough, he had gotten it and everything.
And I
And I'm
came
sitting
home.
down and I'm eating in the living room, and Philip comes in. He talks to me. We're in the couch. We're talking and everything, and he just said, "Well, I don't know how to say this, but I was let go from my job today."
Disruption. Again, another disruption. It's the beginning of it's the housing market crash
Yes.
that actually started a year earlier.
Yes.
And we won't go through the litany of things we tried to do to hang on to our house. And Toni can take that part. But by 2009, the job was lost.
Job was lost.
Income gone.
The majority of our income, I would say probably a good 65%
Yep.
of our income
Gone.
was gone. Now, to put some context to some things, and I'm going to go a little fast with this, is that this was a home that we built. God allowed us to build a home, and go back to podcast, whatever number, you'll know that we got that house on a Circle K, $100.
That's it. That's it. Money order.
Money order.
That was it.
But this is the house that God had given us. We built it, and we initially had a crazy variable mortgage, but he gave me the wherewithal to put it into a fixed mortgage, and so we did that. Now, let's face it, the mortgage the mortgage amount was high. We're talking $2,200 a month, but we were making it. I
had that job. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so in one fell swoop, without
65%.
even getting any type of notification, 65% of our income was gone.
How are we going to pay $22 a month, $100 a month
on my salary, which was
35%.
impossible.
Yep.
Impossible. So we had to go through, because by then, Countrywide Mortgage Company was gone. I mean, bailout to the banks. It was crazy.
Hedge funds were on a nut.
Yeah, it was crazy. So immediately, we had to start thinking about, where do we go? What do we do? Because at the end of the day, we wanted to save our home.
Yes.
We heard of people that would just, hey, walk away. We weren't going to do that.
Yep.
God gave us this home.
Yep.
We weren't just going to walk away.
Even if I say, even my Christian brothers, because I would go to ministerial meetings weekly, and I share with them this, and he says, well, brother, God will make a way. I says, I get that. I says, we saved up. We had savings where we could pay our mortgage, and we did for a few months. I says, but brothers, I says, how do you, and no, I won't, that's a hard one to go into. But the means that we had did not allow us to continue our current obligations. So we ended up.
We went to put it in context, we went, Countrywide was belly up. Bank of America purchased Countrywide. Bank of America says, okay, well, you need to go to this meeting and talk to this representative. And we did that. Literally, we were sitting for hours waiting to talk to a representative. There were hundreds of people in these centers waiting to figure out how to save their mortgage. And once we talked to the representatives, they says, well, we'll get back with you, fill out these forms, form after form after form after form, all to yield nothing.
Yep.
We went to credit counselors trying to figure out, okay, how can we save our mortgage? He says, well, with no income, the numbers don't lie. It's like, well, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah.
We were trying to figure out how to save this house.
And being above board.
But at the end of the day, God said to us, you're going to have to let it go.
You have to let it go. And I believe I did the podcast already, and I'll give you the short version of it, because God had told Toni, and Toni was on board, hey, we got to let it go. I'm still saying, no, God wants me, but that classic line, when God pulled me aside, and I'm boo-hoo in tears and talk about what he gave me, and then God just patiently said, Phil, can I do what I want with what I own? And that's when I said, Uncle, yes, Lord. And we ended up short selling that house.
We put it for sale for a short sale. It did sell.
Yep.
And in October of 2009, mind you, he was let go in March, and we fought and tried from March until October. And we eventually had to say, Uncle, we put it up for a short sale. We were going to be short on it, but that was the only way we could do it. And Philip, praise God, was able to secure a position, a job, because in Arizona he couldn't buy one.
Nope.
We had to go back
to Nashville. Yep.
Across country. So on a fateful October 9th in 2009, we vacuumed our living room and we made everything look pretty. And we put the key in the door for the last time and locked the house.
Yep.
And we put everything in our car and we began to drive away. So stick with us next time for, I won't say the conclusion.
No, for the continuation. See, now our plans was 2 or 3 podcasts.
But I don't know.
We don't know how God's going to do this.
But stick with us.
Yep.
Love you guys. Have a great week.
This episode was produced and edited by Miss K. Simone. Cover graphics by Indefinite. Music by Miss K. Simone. So until next time, I'm Phil Bugs.
And I'm Toni Bugs.
Wishing you a wonderful week.